At 58 years old, I took a homeless man half my age into my bed, thinking I was saving him. But he was the one with the gun, and I was the one who became the prisoner. My name is Opal Harris. I'm 81 now, and for the folks here in Larned, Kansas, I'm just the quiet widow at the end of the lane. They see a woman whose hands are always dusted with a little flour from a morning of baking. Her silver hair pulled back in a simple, practical bun. I'm the one they count on for a cup of sugar or a slice of warm pie. What they don't know is that 23 years ago, my loneliness nearly got me killed. I've carried this weight in my chest, like a stone, for over 2 decades. Never told a soul. Not my children who live their busy lives in distant cities. Not Pastor Williams, who's heard every other sin I've committed. Not even God in my most desperate midnight prayers, but sitting here on this creaky porch, watching the Kansas wheat sway in the evening breeze, I finally understand that some stories are too heavy to take to the grave. The shame of what I did, bringing that stranger into my home, into my bed. That shame has been eating at me like cancer, but the terror of what he did to me after, that's what woke me up screaming for years. I reckon it's time someone knew the truth about what loneliness can drive a woman to do, and what evil can look like when it's wearing the face of someone you're trying to save. So pour yourself some sweet tea and settle in, because I'm about to tell you a story that'll chill you to the bone, and maybe, just maybe, help you understand that even when we make the worst mistakes of our lives, the good Lord still finds a way to bring us home. The thing about loneliness is that it creeps up on you like frost on a window, slow and quiet, until one morning you wake up and can't see through the glass anymore. After Walter passed in the spring of '99, I thought I knew what alone felt like. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. Walter and we'd built our life together like laying bricks, steady, solid, each day adding to what we were building. 42 years of marriage, and suddenly, I was rattling around in our 3-bedroom house like a marble in a coffee can. The silence was so thick I could taste it. My children, bless their hearts, they had their own lives. Sarah was busy with her law practice up in Topeka, and my boy Marcus was raising his twins out in Colorado. They called on Sundays, sent cards on holidays, but they weren't living my everyday quiet. Larned isn't a big place, barely 15,000 souls, most of them good Christian folk who mind their own business. We got Main Street with the old courthouse, the diner where everybody knows your coffee order, and First Baptist where 3 generations of my family have sat in the same pew. Summer here gets so hot the asphalt shimmers like water, and the air conditioning at the Piggly Wiggly becomes a blessing we don't take for granted. But even in a small town where everybody waves at everybody, a widow can disappear without anyone really noticing. I'd taken to talking to Walter's picture on the mantel, asking him what he thought about the weather, about the neighbors, about whether I should plant tomatoes again that year. Pathetic, really. But at least it was a voice in the house, even if it was just my own bouncing off the walls. That's when I started noticing him at the church square on Wednesdays, when I'd go to the farmer's market. A young man, couldn't have been more than 32, 33, sitting on that old iron bench under the oak tree. His clothes were dirty, worn thin as paper, and his hair looked like he'd been cutting it himself with kitchen scissors. But his eyes, Lord have mercy. His eyes held a kind of sadness that reminded me of a beaten dog still hoping for kindness. The first few times I saw him, I just nodded polite-like and went about my business. That's what proper ladies do. Acknowledge folks, but don't get involved. But something about him tugged at me. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, like he was trying not to take up too much space in the world. Maybe it was how he'd tip an imaginary hat when the elderly ladies walked by, showing manners that somebody had taught him once upon a time. Week after week, there he was, rain or shine, That boy was on that bench. I started bringing an extra sandwich from home. Just in case, I told myself. Just Christian charity. Nothing more. When October rolled around and the night started getting cold enough to bite, I began staying awake, worrying about where he went when the sun went down. The ladies at church started whispering. Of course, Mrs. Patterson said he was probably on drugs. Deacon Miller's wife was convinced he was casing houses to rob. But I watched him. Really watched him. And all I saw was somebody who'd lost his way. There's a difference between dangerous and desperate. And I thought I could tell which one he was. I started bringing him that sandwich regular-like, and we'd exchange a few words. His name was Dean, he said, and he'd been traveling, looking for work. His voice was soft, educated even, like he'd had some schooling before whatever happened to put him on that bench. He always thanked me proper, called me ma'am, and never asked for more than what I offered. But loneliness makes fools of us all, and I was about to become the biggest fool in Reno County. The mistake I made was thinking I could save somebody who didn't want saving. What I didn't know was that sometimes the person you're trying to rescue is actually hunting for prey, and kindness can be the bait that leads you straight into a trap you never saw coming. That first time I brought Dean a sandwich, my hands were shaking like autumn leaves. I'd made ham and cheese on white bread. Nothing fancy, just something to fill an empty belly. When I approached that bench, he looked up at me with eyes the color of storm clouds, and I swear I felt something shift in my chest, like a door I'd kept locked was creaking open just a crack. He smelled like October rain and unwashed clothes. But underneath that was something else, something clean, like soap. He'd managed to find somewhere. When he took that sandwich from my hands, his fingers brushed mine for just a second, and they were softer than I expected. Not the rough, calloused hands of a man who'd been doing hard labor. That should have been my first warning. But loneliness has a way of making you ignore the things that don't fit the story you want to believe. We started talking. Little bits at first. He told me he'd been traveling for months, that he'd lost his job at a factory back east, and been living rough ever since. His voice had a gentleness to it that reminded me of how Walter used to talk when he was trying to comfort me after one of my mother's particularly cruel visits. Dean would ask about my day, about the weather, about whether the tomatoes in my garden were still producing. Simple questions, but they were the first real conversations I'd had in months that weren't with checkout clerks or telemarketers. I found myself looking forward to Wednesdays with an anticipation that felt almost sinful. I'd wake up thinking about what kind of sandwich to make, wondering if he'd still be there on that bench. The night before market day, I'd catch myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror, checking to see if my gray hair looked presentable, if the lines around my eyes had gotten deeper. Foolish thoughts for a woman pushing 60. But grief and loneliness can make you feel like you're disappearing, and Dean's attention made me feel visible again. By November, our conversations had stretched longer. He'd tell me stories about places he'd been, cities I'd only seen in magazines, descriptions of sunsets over mountains I'd never see. I began bringing coffee in a thermos, and we'd sit on that bench together while the Kansas wind carried the smell of wheat chaff and changing seasons. He never asked for money, never asked for more than what I offered. That restraint made me trust him more than I should have. The day everything changed was when I found him shivering so hard his teeth were chattering, like castanets. November had turned cruel overnight, and frost was already forming on the courthouse steps even though it was barely 4 in the afternoon. His lips had a blue tinge that scared me, and when I touched his shoulder to offer him my extra sweater, I could feel the cold radiating through his thin jacket like he was made of ice. That's when I heard myself saying words I'd never planned to say. I told him he could come warm up at my house, just for a little while, just until the worst of the cold passed. The way his face changed when I said those words, the relief, the gratitude, something else I couldn't quite name. It made me feel like I was doing something holy, something Walter would have approved of. My house felt different with him in it. Suddenly the silence I'd been drowning in was filled with the sound of another person breathing, moving, existing in my space. He was polite as Sunday service, took off his shoes at the door, asked permission before using the bathroom, complimented the photographs of my grandchildren on the mantelpiece. When I served him soup and cornbread at my kitchen table, he ate like a man who'd forgotten what a home-cooked meal tasted like. But there was something else happening, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. Not like I was just a kind old lady, but like I was a woman worth looking at. It had been so long since anyone had seen me that way that I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel desired instead of just useful. I should have known that the devil doesn't come wearing horns and carrying a pitchfork. Sometimes he comes wearing gratitude and speaking softly, and he waits until you've opened every door before he shows you what he really wants. That November night when I invited Dean to stay until the cold snap passed, I told myself it was just Christian charity. Just one night, maybe two, until he could figure out his next move. But deep in my heart, in that place where we keep the truths, we're afraid to speak out loud, I knew I was lying to myself. I wanted him to stay, wanted the house to feel alive again, wanted to matter to someone who wasn't obligated to love me by blood or marriage vows. The first 3 days were like playing house with a stranger. Dean helped with little things around the house, tightened the loose handle on the kitchen faucet, swept leaves off the front porch, carried in firewood without being asked. He was careful to give me space, sleeping on the living room couch even though I'd offered him the spare bedroom. At meals, he'd compliment my cooking with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been eating from garbage cans. And I found myself making bigger portions, more elaborate dishes, just to see that look of appreciation in his eyes. But it was the little intimacies that started changing everything. The way he'd appear in the kitchen doorway in the morning, hair tousled from sleep, asking if I needed help with breakfast. How he'd sit beside me on the couch in the evenings while I watched my stories on television, close enough that I could smell his shampoo. My shampoo, really, since he was using everything I had. The sound of him humming while he shaved in my bathroom, using Walter's old razor that I'd never had the heart to throw away. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when I was washing dishes, and Dean came up behind me to help dry. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing I could point to and call wrong. But when he reached around me to put a plate in the cabinet, his chest pressed against my back for just a moment. I felt the warmth of his body through my house dress, smelled the scent of him mixed with my lavender soap, and something electric shot through me that I hadn't felt since Walter was young and strong and alive. I turned around too fast, and suddenly we were standing face to face, closer than proper. Closer than a widow and a homeless stranger should ever be. His eyes were darker in the kitchen light, and I could see tiny flecks of gold around the pupils. For a heartbeat, maybe two. We just stood there breathing the same air, and I felt like a foolish schoolgirl instead of a woman old enough to know better. That night, I lay in my empty bed listening to him moving around downstairs, and I couldn't stop thinking about how his hands had looked, holding my good china. How carefully he dried each piece like it mattered to him, because it mattered to me. I started imagining what it would be like to not be alone anymore, to have someone to talk to over morning coffee, someone to share the newspaper with, someone warm beside me. When the Kansas wind howled around the house corners, the next morning I caught myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. My cheeks had color for the first time in months, and my eyes looked brighter, more alive. I was taking extra care with my appearance, wearing my nicer house dresses. The ones Walter used to say brought out the blue in my eyes. I was acting like a woman with something to hope for, and that realization scared me more than I wanted to admit. But the real moment of no return came when I walked into the living room and found Dean sitting on my couch, holding the framed photograph of Walter and me from our 25th anniversary. He was studying it with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not jealousy exactly, but something like calculation. Like he was measuring himself against the man who'd loved me for 4 decades. When he noticed me watching him, he didn't look embarrassed or put the picture down quickly like someone caught snooping would do. Instead, he smiled and said, Walter looked like he'd been a good man, a lucky man to have had me for so long. The way he said it, with that soft voice and those storm cloud eyes looking right into mine, made me feel like he was asking a question I wasn't ready to answer. That night, for the first time since Walter died, I didn't cry myself to sleep. Instead, I lay awake thinking about tomorrow, about next week, about whether Dean might want to stay through Christmas, through winter, maybe longer. I was planning a future with a man I'd known for less than 2 weeks, a man whose last name I didn't even know, a man who could disappear as suddenly as he'd appeared. I should have remembered that. When something seems too good to be true, it usually is. But loneliness had made me hungry for hope. And hope, when you've been starving for it, can make you swallow poison and call it honey. The moment that changed everything happened on a Saturday night in late November. I remember it was Saturday because earlier that day I'd made my weekly trip to the Piggly Wiggly, and Mrs. Henderson from down the street had asked about the young man she'd seen working in my yard. Her tone carried that particular brand of small-town curiosity that sits right on the edge of judgment, and I found myself getting defensive, explaining that Dean was just helping out temporarily, that it was Christian charity, nothing more. But walking through those grocery store aisles, I caught myself buying things I hadn't bought in years, good steaks instead of the ground beef I'd been living on, fresh bread from the bakery instead of the day-old loaves, even a bottle of wine that I told myself was for cooking, but knew I'd never use in any recipe. I was shopping like a woman expecting company, like a woman who wanted to impress someone, and the realization made my cheeks burn with something between shame and anticipation. When I got home, Dean was waiting on the front porch, and he'd cleaned up more than usual. His hair was combed back neat, and he was wearing the spare shirt I'd bought him. Said it was Walter's old one, though that was a lie since Walter had been a much smaller man. The November sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows across the yard, and for a moment he looked like something out of a dream, like the answer to prayers I'd been too afraid to pray. He helped me carry in the groceries, and when he saw the steaks, his whole face lit up with genuine pleasure. It had been months since he'd had a proper meal, he said, and the way he said it made me feel like I was giving him something precious instead of just planning dinner. We worked together in the kitchen, him washing vegetables while I seasoned the meat, and it felt so natural, so right, like we'd been doing this dance for years instead of weeks. Over dinner we talked about things we'd never discussed before. He told me about his childhood, about a mother who'd died too young and a father who'd drunk himself to death shortly after. He'd had some college, he said, but circumstances had forced him to leave, and since then he'd been drifting from place to place, looking for somewhere to belong. The wine made his voice softer, more vulnerable, and when he reached across the table to touch my hand while he was talking, I didn't pull away. After dinner, we sat on the couch watching the late movie, and gradually the space between us got smaller. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could point to and say, that's when it happened. Just the gradual closing of distance between two people who'd been lonely too long. His shoulder touched mine. His hand brushed my arm when he reached for his coffee cup. Small touches, innocent touches, but each one sent electricity through me that I hadn't felt since I was young. When the movie ended, we just sat there in the blue glow of the television screen, not talking, both of us knowing something was happening, but neither of us ready to name it. The silence stretched between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. And then Dean turned to look at me with those storm cloud eyes and said my name so softly. It was almost a whisper. I want to say I don't remember making the choice, that it just happened without any decision on my part, but that would be another lie. When Dean leaned toward me, when his hand came up to touch my cheek, when his lips brushed mine so gently, it felt like a question being asked. I had a moment, one clear, sober moment, where I could have stopped everything, could have pulled back, could have said this wasn't appropriate, could have remembered that I was a 60-year-old widow, and he was a homeless man young enough to be my son. Instead, I kissed him back. What followed was like falling down a well in the dark, terrifying and exhilarating, and completely beyond my control. 23 years later, sitting here on this porch, I can still remember every detail of that night. How his hand shook when he touched me, like I was something fragile he was afraid of breaking. How he whispered that I was beautiful, that I was saving his life, that he'd never known kindness like mine. How we moved together through my house like sleepwalkers, up the stairs, past the photographs of my life with Walter, into the bedroom where I'd slept alone for so long. I won't pretend it was beautiful or romantic like in the movies. We were both too desperate, too hungry for connection, too aware of how wrong it was and how right it felt at the same time. But afterward, lying in my bed with Dean's arm around me and his breathing deep and even beside me, I felt something I thought had died with Walter. I felt wanted, needed, alive in a way that had nothing to do with being useful or proper or good. The guilt came later, of course. It always does. When I woke up the next morning and saw Dean in Walter's place, using Walter's pillow, his dark hair spread across sheets that still smelled faintly of my husband's aftershave, the shame hit me like a physical blow. What kind of woman was I? What kind of Christian? What kind of wife, even a widowed one? But then Dean opened his eyes and smiled at me with such genuine affection, such gratitude, that the guilt got pushed down under something stronger. The intoxicating feeling of being desired, of mattering to someone in a way I'd thought was over for me, forever. That morning, over breakfast, everything felt different. The very air in the house seemed charged with possibility. Dean talked about maybe staying through Christmas, maybe longer if I'd have him. He talked about getting a job in town, about making this arrangement more permanent. And I found myself nodding along like a woman who'd found her future, instead of a fool who'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't know yet that I wasn't his savior. I was his mark, and the trap was already closing around me. The first week after that November night passed like a fever dream. Dean moved his few possessions from the living room into my bedroom, and suddenly, my house felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone younger, someone who hadn't spent the last 2 years talking to photographs and eating dinner alone. I caught myself humming while I cooked breakfast, wearing lipstick to the grocery store, caring about things I'd stopped caring about when Walter died. But small towns have eyes everywhere, and it didn't take long for those eyes to start noticing. Mrs. Patterson from across the street began finding excuses to work in her front garden whenever Dean was outside. The mailman started lingering longer than necessary, making small talk about the weather, while his gaze wandered toward my front door. At the Piggly Wiggly, conversation stopped when I walked down the aisles, then resumed in whispers after I'd passed. I told myself I didn't care what people thought. I was a grown woman, a widow, entitled to companionship if I could find it. But the weight of their watching, their judging, their whispered conversations at the post office and the diner began to press down on me like stones on my chest. Larned was the kind of place where reputation mattered, where what people thought about you could determine whether you got invited to church socials or found yourself gradually frozen out of the community you'd called home for 40 years. Dean seemed oblivious to the scrutiny. Or maybe he just didn't care. He'd taken to answering my phone when I was busy, telling callers that Mrs. Harris was indisposed, speaking with an authority that made it sound like he belonged there. When my daughter Sarah called from Topeka, he chatted with her for 15 minutes before handing me the phone, and I could hear the confusion in her voice when she asked who that nice young man was. The lies came easier than they should have. I told Sarah he was a distant cousin down on his luck, helping around the house in exchange for room and board. I told the ladies at church he was a traveling handyman I'd hired for the winter. I told myself these weren't really lies, just adjustments to a truth that people wouldn't understand. But each lie felt like swallowing something bitter, and I began to realize that the life I was building with Dean required me to become someone I'd never been before, someone who deceived people, someone who hid things, someone who lived in the shadows. The change in Dean was subtle at first, so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. The gratitude in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something that looked more like expectation. He stopped asking permission for things, using my car, eating the last of something in the refrigerator, changing the television channel in the middle of programs I was watching. Small things, tiny shifts in behavior that individually meant nothing, but together began to form a pattern that made me uneasy. One December morning, I found him going through the papers in Walter's old desk, looking through bank statements and insurance documents with the focused attention of someone conducting business rather than the idle curiosity of a houseguest. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled that same gentle smile and said he was just trying to understand my financial situation so he could help me make better decisions. The way he said it, so reasonable and caring, made me feel foolish for questioning him. But something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the winter weather. That evening, while we were watching television, Dean casually mentioned that my house was worth more than I probably realized, that property values in small Kansas towns were surprisingly strong. He talked about how a woman my age shouldn't have to worry about maintaining such a large place, how there were nice apartments in town that would be much more manageable. He spoke like he was looking out for my best interests, but his hand on my arm felt heavier than it used to, more possessive than affectionate. I began to notice other things. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, his eyes calculating rather than loving, how he'd grown increasingly comfortable making decisions about my life without consulting me, the gradual way he'd taken over conversations with visitors, speaking for me before I could speak for myself. But I pushed these observations down, buried them under the fear of being alone again, because the truth was becoming clear, even if I wasn't ready to face it yet. Dean wasn't the grateful gentleman I'd rescued from that church bench. He was something else entirely, and I was just beginning to understand what I'd really invited into my home. Christmas of 1999 should have been the loneliest Christmas of my life, but instead it became the most terrifying. By then, Dean had been living in my house for over a month, and what had started as a rescue mission had turned into something I was beginning to recognize as captivity, though I didn't have the courage to call it that yet. The transformation had been so gradual that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when the grateful gentleman I'd brought home had disappeared, replaced by someone who felt entitled to everything I had. It was like watching a photograph fade in reverse. Instead of losing clarity, Dean was gaining definition, and the picture that was emerging wasn't one I wanted to see. He'd taken over Walter's side of the bed completely, spreading his few possessions across the dresser top, where my husband's reading glasses and pocket watch used to sit. More disturbing was how he'd begun wearing Walter's clothes. Shirts that were too small for him, stretched tight across his broader chest, making him look like he was wearing a costume of my dead husband's life. When I mentioned it made me uncomfortable, he'd looked at me with those storm cloud eyes and said he thought I'd want him to make himself at home, that it hurt his feelings when I acted like he didn't belong. The guilt was a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. every time I questioned something he did, every time I expressed discomfort with how quickly our arrangement was changing, he'd remind me how much I'd needed him, how empty my life had been before he came along. He'd touch my face gently and ask if I wanted to go back to being the lonely old woman talking to photographs, if I really preferred eating every meal by myself, if I missed lying awake at night with nothing but the sound of my own breathing to keep me company. And the terrible truth was, I didn't want to go back to that emptiness. The loneliness had been killing me slowly, day by day, and Dean's presence, even this increasingly uncomfortable version of it, was still better than the silence that had nearly driven me to madness. So I swallowed my objections, pushed down my growing unease, and told myself I was being oversensitive, that relationships required compromise, that maybe this was just how things worked when you started over later in life. The money situation became clear in mid-December when I went to the bank to make my usual deposit and discovered that someone had been making withdrawals from my account. Not huge amounts, $50 here, $100 there, but enough to notice when you live on a fixed income like I did. When I confronted Dean about it, he didn't deny it. Instead, he explained in that same reasonable tone he used for everything now, that he'd needed cash for Christmas shopping, that he wanted to surprise me with gifts, that he'd figured I wouldn't mind since we were sharing everything else. The logic was sound enough to make me doubt my own reaction. After all, we were sleeping in the same bed, eating from the same kitchen, living as a couple in every way that mattered. Wasn't it natural that he'd have access to resources? Wasn't it selfish of me to hoard money when he was giving me so much in return? But the fact that he'd taken it without asking, that he'd somehow gotten access to my account information, left me feeling violated in a way I couldn't articulate. That's when I started finding his belongings in places they shouldn't be. My jewelry box had been opened and rifled through, though nothing seemed to be missing. The spare key to my safe deposit box, which I kept hidden in an old coffee can in the pantry, had been moved. Papers in Walter's desk were in different order than I'd left them. Dean was studying my life like a student preparing for an exam, learning everything there was to know about my finances, my possessions, my vulnerabilities. The physical intimacy between us had changed too, becoming less about connection and more about control. Dean would touch me with the casual possessiveness of ownership, his hands on my shoulders steering me in directions he wanted me to go, his arm around my waist holding me in place during conversations with neighbors, his fingers running through my hair while he made decisions about our evening plans without consulting me. I began to feel like a doll being posed by someone else's hands. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. I'd invited my neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, over for coffee and cookies, a tradition Walter and I had maintained for 15 years. She was 84, a sweet Polish woman whose husband had died the same year as Walter, and our weekly visits had been one of the few social connections I'd maintained after becoming a widow. Dean was charm itself when she arrived, helping her with her coat, complimenting her cookies, asking about her grandchildren with apparent genuine interest. But I could see Mrs. Kowalski's confusion, the way her eyes kept darting between Dean and me, trying to understand what she was seeing. When she asked in her direct way how long Dean had been staying with me, he answered before I could speak, spinning an elaborate story about being my late sister's stepson, down from Michigan to help me through the holidays. I'd never had a sister. Walter had been an only child, and so had I. Mrs. Kowalski knew this, had known my family for decades, and I watched her face change as she realized Dean was lying with the easy confidence of someone who did it regularly. But instead of confronting him, she looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been fear, and I realized she was seeing something in my situation that I was still trying not to see myself. After she left, Dean was furious. Not screaming furious, he was too smart for that, but cold, controlled, angry. He wanted to know why I'd invited someone over without asking him, why I was exposing our business to neighbors who might not understand our situation, why I was making things complicated when they could be simple. His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but his hands on my arms left bruises, and for the first time since he'd moved in, I was genuinely afraid of what he might do if I didn't agree with him. That night, lying in bed beside him, listening to his breathing in the darkness, I finally admitted the truth I'd been running from. I wasn't sharing my life with Dean. He was taking it, piece by piece, and I was too ashamed of my own desperation to stop him. The new year of 2000 brought with it a cold snap that seemed to freeze more than just the Kansas landscape. It froze something inside me that had been slowly dying since Christmas Eve. January was brutal that year, with ice storms that knocked out power lines and winds that made stepping outside feel like walking into knives. Dean used the weather as another reason why I needed him, why a woman my age shouldn't be living alone in such a big house during such dangerous conditions. But the real danger wasn't outside my house anymore. It was sleeping beside me every night, eating at my table every morning, and slowly erasing the woman I had been for 60 years. Dean had stopped pretending to look for work. When I'd bring up the subject, he'd remind me that nobody was hiring in the middle of winter, that it made more sense for him to focus on taking care of me in the house. But what he called taking care felt more like taking over. He'd rearranged my kitchen cabinets to suit his preferences, moved furniture without asking, thrown away things that belonged to Walter because he said it wasn't healthy for me to live in a shrine to the past. The worst part was how reasonable he made everything sound when I protested that I liked my kitchen organized the way it had been for 40 years. He'd explain that his way was more efficient. When I got upset about him discarding Walter's favorite coffee mug, he'd hold me while I cried and say he was only trying to help me heal, that holding on to painful reminders was keeping me stuck in grief instead of moving forward with our life together. Our life together. That phrase had started appearing in his conversations more and more, always spoken with the assumption that we'd made some agreement I didn't remember making. He talked about plans for spring, improvements to the house, maybe getting married so he could be on my insurance, possibly selling the place and moving somewhere warmer where an older woman wouldn't have to deal with Kansas winters. The way he spoke about these futures, it was clear he expected me to go along with whatever he decided. My isolation had become complete without me fully realizing it was happening. Dean answered my phone now as a matter of course, screening my calls and delivering messages that always seemed to discourage visitors. When Sarah called from Topeka, he'd tell her I was resting, wasn't feeling well, was too busy with household projects to come to the phone. When the ladies from church called about committee meetings or potluck dinners, he'd explain that I wasn't up to socializing much these days, that I preferred quiet evenings at home. The truth was, I'd stopped trying to maintain those connections myself. Every social interaction had become a minefield of lies I had to remember, stories Dean had told that I had to support, explanations I had to give for why I looked thinner, more nervous, more like a woman living under constant stress than one who'd found late-life love. It was easier to stay home, to avoid the questions I couldn't answer honestly, to pretend that my shrinking world was a choice rather than a result of Dean's steady campaign to cut me off from everyone who might notice what was happening to me. The financial control had become absolute. Dean now managed all my accounts, explaining that he had a better head for numbers than I did, that women my age were frequent targets for financial scams, that it was safer if he handled all the money matters. My Social Security check was direct deposited into an account he'd convinced me to make joint, and my access to cash required his approval. When I needed something from the store, I had to ask Dean for money, like a child asking for an allowance, and he'd question every purchase, every expense, every small desire for independence. But it was the discovery I made in early February that finally cracked the shell of denial I'd been living in. While Dean was outside chopping firewood, one of the few helpful activities he still performed, I was cleaning our bedroom and moved his jacket to hang it properly in the closet. The jacket was heavier than it should have been, and when I checked the pockets to see if he'd left something in them, my hand closed around something cold and metallic that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was a small pistol, black and deadly looking, wrapped in an oily cloth that smelled like metal and violence. I'd never held a gun before, never wanted to, and the weight of it in my palm felt like holding concentrated evil. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it, and when I rewrapped it and put it back exactly where I'd found it, I could hear my heart beating in my ears like a drum. Dean had never mentioned owning a gun, never talked about needing protection or feeling unsafe. The only reason a man would carry a concealed weapon without telling the woman he was living with was if he thought he might need to use it on her. That night, lying beside him in the darkness, I finally understood what I'd really brought into my home. Finding that gun changed everything, even though I tried to pretend it didn't. For 3 days after discovering it, I went through the motions of our daily routine. Making breakfast, watching television together, accepting his kisses and touches, all while knowing that somewhere in our bedroom was a weapon he'd kept hidden from me. Every time he reached into that jacket pocket, every time he moved in a way that made the fabric shift, I'd tense up like a rabbit sensing a predator nearby. The knowledge ate at me like acid. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and watch Dean sleeping beside me, wondering what kind of man felt the need to carry a gun while living with a 60-year-old widow in small-town Kansas. What was he afraid of? Or worse, who was he planning to use it on? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, dark thoughts that made every ordinary moment feel charged with danger. I started paying attention to things I'd been willfully ignoring. The way Dean's eyes would go cold when he thought I wasn't looking, like shutters closing over windows. How he'd clench his jaw when I asked questions about his past, about where he'd come from or why he'd been living on the streets. The calculated way he touched me now, like he was handling property rather than showing affection. All those red flags I'd been too lonely and desperate to see were suddenly impossible to miss. But what scared me most was realizing how trapped I'd become. Dean controlled my money, my phone calls, my social connections. He'd systematically isolated me from everyone who might help, and I'd let him do it because the alternative, admitting I'd made a terrible mistake, facing the shame and judgment of my community, had seemed worse than the slow loss of my independence. Now I understood that what I'd mistaken for love was actually a carefully planned takeover of my entire life. The decision to ask him to leave came to me on a Thursday morning in late February, while I was making coffee, and Dean was in the shower. I could hear him singing, actually singing, some song I didn't recognize, and the casual happiness in his voice while I was living in fear struck me as obscene. This was my house, my life, my choice, and I'd given all of that away to a man who carried a hidden gun and lied as easily as breathing. I spent the day rehearsing what I'd say. I practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, whispered my speech while I folded laundry, repeated the words under my breath while I cooked dinner. I would be kind but firm. I would explain that our arrangement wasn't working out, that I needed time to myself, that it would be better for both of us if he found somewhere else to stay. I would offer to help him get back on his feet. Maybe pay for a week in a motel, give him money for bus fare to wherever he wanted to go. I would be charitable but clear. He had to leave. But when the moment came, when we were sitting at my kitchen table after dinner, and I opened my mouth to speak those carefully rehearsed words, what came out instead was a question that surprised us both. "Dean, why do you have a gun?" The change in him was instantaneous and terrifying. The easy smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression so cold and calculating that I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. His body went perfectly still in that way. Predators go still when they're deciding whether to attack or retreat, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, flat, emotionless, like he'd dropped a mask he'd been wearing for months. He asked how I'd found it, and when I explained about moving his jacket, he nodded slowly, like he was filing away information about my habits, my movements, my tendency to clean and organize. Then he looked me directly in the eyes and told me the gun was for protection, that a man living on the streets learned to be careful, that he'd forgotten he even had it. But his explanation felt rehearsed, like something he'd prepared for this exact moment. And the way he was looking at me, studying my face, measuring my reaction, calculating something behind those storm cloud eyes, made me understand that I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. By discovering his secret, by asking about it directly, I'd forced him to show me who he really was, and we both knew there was no going back to pretending anymore. That night, the gun appeared on the kitchen table. Not threatening, exactly, but not hidden either. Dean placed it there while I was washing dishes, setting it down with the casual matter-of-factness of someone laying out silverware. When I asked what he was doing, he said he figured there was no point in hiding it anymore since I already knew about it. He said it with a smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and the message was clear. The game had changed, and now we were playing by different rules. I lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, listening to Dean's breathing beside me, and thinking about how trapped I was. He had keys to my house, access to my bank accounts, knowledge of my daily routines and my weaknesses. He'd cut me off from my friends and family, so gradually that I couldn't even remember exactly how it had happened. And now he had a gun on my kitchen table, a silent reminder of what could happen to women who caused problems for men like him. But somewhere in the darkest part of that sleepless night, a spark of the woman I used to be flickered to life. I might have been trapped, but I wasn't dead yet. I might have made the worst mistake of my life, but that didn't mean I had to let it kill me. I'd survived 60 years without Dean, including 2 years as a widow that had nearly broken me. And I could survive, whatever came next. I just had to figure out how to get out alive. In the morning, I would begin planning my escape. But that night, I lay perfectly still and let Dean think he'd won. Because sometimes the only way to survive a predator is to make him believe you're already dead. The end came faster than I expected, and from a direction I never saw coming. It was a Saturday morning in early March when my grandson Ethan showed up at my front door, unannounced, grinning that crooked smile that reminded me so much of his grandfather, and carrying a duffel bag that meant he was planning to stay a while. Ethan was 22 then, a junior at Kansas State studying agriculture, and he'd driven down from Manhattan with some college friends who were continuing on to Oklahoma for spring break. He'd decided to surprise his old grandma with a visit, maybe help with some projects around the house, catch up on family news over my homemade biscuits and gravy. Sweet boy had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. Dean handled the surprise about as well as a man with secrets could. He answered the door before I could get there, introducing himself with that same charming smile he'd used on everyone else, explaining that he was helping Mrs. Harris with maintenance work around the house. But I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the quick assessment of this new threat to his carefully constructed situation. Ethan, bless his heart, was too young and trusting to see what I was seeing. He shook Dean's hand, complimented him on the work he'd done around the yard, made easy conversation about the weather and the drive down from college. But I watched my grandson's face during that first interaction, saw the brief flicker of confusion when Dean spoke with too much familiarity about my daily routines, when he answered questions about my health and habits, like he'd been living here for years instead of months. That first day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I cooked a big dinner. We sat around the table making conversation, and Dean played the role of helpful family friend with Oscar-worthy performance. But the tension was electric, crackling under every ordinary moment. Dean kept touching me, his hand on my shoulder, his arm around my waist, marking his territory in front of Ethan like a dog marking a fence post. And I could see my grandson starting to notice things. How thin I'd gotten, how jumpy I was around sudden noises, how I kept glancing at Dean before answering even simple questions. The breaking point came on Sunday night. Dean had taken my car to drive into town for cigarettes, something he'd started doing more frequently since Ethan arrived. Like he needed time away to plan his next moves. Ethan and I were washing dishes together, and in the quiet of that ordinary moment, my grandson asked the question I'd been dreading. "Grandma, are you okay? You seem different. Scared, maybe?" The concern in his voice, the genuine love and worry, broke something loose inside me that I'd been keeping locked down for months. Before I could stop myself, tears were streaming down my face, and the whole horrible story came pouring out like water through a burst dam. I told him about the loneliness that had made me vulnerable, about Dean's gradual takeover of my life, about the gun on the kitchen table and the way I'd become a prisoner in my own home. Ethan listened without interrupting, his young face growing darker with each revelation, his hands clenched into fists by the time I finished. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment, then asked to see the gun. We went to the kitchen, and there it was on the table where Dean left it every night now, black and ugly, and impossible to explain away. That's when Ethan pulled out his cell phone, one of those new things that barely worked half the time, but somehow managed to connect him to 911 that night. He spoke quietly, quickly, giving our address and explaining that his grandmother was being held against her will by an armed man who would be returning soon. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, to get to a safe place, to stay quiet until help arrived. We turned off all the lights and waited in my bedroom closet like children hiding from monsters. And maybe that's exactly what we were. Through the window, we could see headlights coming up the driveway. Dean returning from town, probably expecting to find us settled in for another evening of his carefully orchestrated control. Instead, he found 3 police cars waiting in my driveway, and his nightmare finally coming to an end. The police arrested Dean without incident, though the look he gave me as they led him away in handcuffs was cold enough to freeze hell itself. They found the gun, of course, and when they ran it through their computers, that's when the real story came to light. The story that Dean had never told me during all those months of lies and manipulation. His real name wasn't Dean. It was Marcus Holloway, and he was wanted in 3 states for what they called romance fraud, targeting lonely, older women, moving into their homes, gaining access to their finances, and disappearing with whatever he could steal. But I wasn't his first victim to be threatened with violence, and according to Detective Williams, who interviewed me the next day, I probably wouldn't have been his last. The gun was stolen, taken during a burglary in Oklahoma, where an elderly woman had been beaten so badly she'd spent 2 weeks in the hospital. That woman, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, had made the same mistake I had, saw a man in need, and opened her heart and her home to him. The difference was, she'd tried to throw him out after only 2 weeks, and he'd beaten her unconscious before ransacking her house and disappearing with her life savings. I was supposed to be victim number 7 in a string of crimes that stretched back 5 years. But Detective Williams explained something that chilled me to the bone. I was the first victim Dean, Marcus, had stayed with for months instead of weeks. The first one he'd seemed to be planning something more permanent with. When they searched his belongings, they found copies of my insurance papers, my will, even research he'd done on Kansas inheritance laws. He hadn't been planning to rob me and disappear. He'd been planning to marry me, isolate me completely, and wait for me to die. Naturally or otherwise, the detective's words still ring in my ears 23 years later. Mrs. Harris, we think you were being groomed to become his wife so he could inherit everything when you passed away. Given his history of violence, we don't think he was planning to wait for natural causes. The trial was a blur of testimony and evidence that painted a picture of a predator more calculating and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Other victims came forward. Women from Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, all telling similar stories of loneliness, exploited, trust betrayed, lives nearly destroyed. We were all older, all widowed, all desperate enough for companionship that we'd ignored the warning signs until it was almost too late. Marcus Holloway was sentenced to 25 years in prison for multiple counts of fraud, theft, and assault. The judge said she hoped he'd use that time to reflect on the lives he'd destroyed and the trust he'd violated. I hoped he'd rot in there, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. But here's the twist that surprised everyone, including me. The experience didn't destroy my faith in love or companionship. If anything, it taught me the difference between desperation and genuine connection. 6 months after the trial, I started volunteering at the senior center, helping other widows navigate their grief and loneliness. I learned that I wasn't unusual in my vulnerability, that predators like Marcus specifically target women like us because they know how hungry we are for human connection. 3 years later, I met Harold at a church social, a genuine widower whose wife had died of cancer, who courted me properly, introduced me to his children and grandchildren, who made me laugh instead of making me afraid. We had 5 good years together before his heart gave out, and every day of those 5 years reminded me what real love feels like, compared to the counterfeit version Marcus had sold me. I'm 81 now, and I've learned that loneliness is survivable, but losing yourself to someone who wants to destroy you isn't. My story isn't about the shame of being fooled. It's about the strength it takes to save yourself when you realize you're in danger, and the courage to trust again when the right person comes along. If my words have found their way to you tonight, if you're watching this from wherever you are in this big world, remember this: it's better to be alone than to be with someone who makes you disappear. Your life has value, your story matters, and it's never too late to start over. Now tell me, what city are you watching from? I'd love to know how far my voice has traveled, and if you found the courage to share your own story, I'd be honored to hear it. Subscribe if these old words have touched your heart, because every soul deserves to know they're not alone.